Assalamu alaikum. You're watching Views and News, and I'm Faisal Rehman live from our Islamabad studios. Today we'll be talking about the situation in the Middle East. Now, talking about Iran, obviously there were protests there. If you remember, the oil prices were raised by almost 50%. There were a lot of people. There were protests in Tehran and other cities as well as even in Shiraz. And according to the Amnesty, around 208 people got killed and thousands of them were injured. And according to certain reports, even the government claimed for the price of those bullets which were used. Now, there are a lot of different opinions from the government side. They believe that maybe they were snipers. They also said that they were people, because most of these people who were killed during the protests, either they were shot in the head or they were shot in the chest. So primarily, somebody was taking aims and shooting. So now this is something very important. The whole world is talking about it. Now moving on to Iraq. The Prime Minister of Iraq resigned, a lot of chaos. And in Iraq, it is believed that around 400 people died during the protests, which started in October, and around 15,000 to 19,000 were also injured. And there was no control of the government, so eventually the president said that now we are looking forward for another election and the prime minister had to step down. You talk about Lebanon, a lot of issues are prevailing there as well. Hezbollah in particular is not the favorite there anymore, though they have a very vital and important role as far as the politics of Lebanon is concerned. But having said that, there are issues about that area. Talking about Syria, we all know what's happening out there. Even today, civilians were killed in an airstrike by the Syrian Air Force. You move on to other areas for that matter. Problem along the border of Turkey with Syria, that's continuing. Joint patrolling has started between the Russian forces and the Turkish forces all along that particular piece. This is a very important area because when you talk about certain statements coming from the Americans and practically threatening, forget about these sanctions, they are so tight, yet the Iranians are surviving. But now there was this very strong statement, none other than from General Soleimani. He said that around 140 different targets of the American bases and planes and their stationed other assets are well within the reach of the Iranians. And if something happens, they will go after those with all the guns blazing. Now that was a threat. Obviously, this was a reaction. The Iranian President, Mr. Rouhani, believes that something very serious is happening with the support of the Saudis, with the support of the Israelis and the Americans, and they are looking forward to topple the government in Iran. Now, this is their concern also, and most likely another very important story which emerged was that during these protests, thousands of people were arrested. Later on, they were released, but 8 of them were CIA agents also. So you can well imagine Saad Hariri on that side had to resign. There was a lot of pressure. So putting pressure, that's another tactic. But what exactly is going to happen in the Middle East? That is the most important area, and it directly affects the entire world, whether you talk about the energy resources or otherwise. A lot of trade routes are actually from that area, whether you talk about going towards the western side or you talk about the extreme east, whether you talk about India or Japan or China for that matter, their main fuel lines are passing through this area. So there's a lot of concern also. To talk about that and to throw light on this particular issue, let me introduce you to our panelists. We have with us in our studio on my right is Ambassador Aslam Rizvi Saab. Rizvi Saab is a senior diplomat. Sir, thank you very much for taking out your time and being a part of the show. And we also have with us Air Vice Marshal retired Faisal Saab, who's a senior analyst and is also the Vice Chancellor of the Air University, Islamabad. Sir, thank you very much. And we'll be also joined by Imran Jan Saab, who's a senior journalist. Thank you very much, Imran Saab, for also being a part of our show, sir. Now, Ambassador, first of all, sir, let's start off from the Iranian part. Mr. Jawad Zarif hasn't given any statement so far, sir, regarding that, the foreign minister. Even Rouhani Saab is pretty quiet and he's trying to observe what's happening. But obviously, sir, when we talk about the influence of the Iranians in Iraq or within this particular patch, sir, or you talk about Syria for that matter, it seems that in 3 countries where they have this influence through Hezbollah or other means, that is getting eroded now. And the writing on the wall is getting very clear, and the division within the Middle Eastern countries is also very visible. Your take on that part, sir?
Well, first, let me just say that Mr. Pompeo, the Secretary of State, had made a statement with regards to what's happening in Iraq, Beirut, and Tehran. He had said the villain in this is Iran. I would suggest that perhaps he should do some introspection, and he would find that it is his country which is really to blame for the present chaos that is happening in the Middle East. Let's take Iran for that matter. Iran, as you know, since the 1979, when the Shah's regime was toppled, has been having a adversarial relationship with the United States of America. They have had a period of war with 8 years in the 80s with Iraq. There has also been, of course, the Gulf Wars, and at the end of which it emerged as the kingmaker, especially in Iraq. Its position was strengthened. So the influence started there, and the present state, we have seen that ever since that time, the America in particular and other Western countries, and more recently, Saudi Arabia joining Israel as well, trying to bring about a regime change. It's not something which is speculative, it is a stated policy of the United States. They have allocated funding for the regime change purpose also. Yes. The Iranians are no strangers to handling demonstrations. We saw that happening in, I think, 2009 when there was a students' demonstration. We also saw when after the elections, presidential elections, there was demonstrations also. And 2017, there were also demonstrations. The underlying reason behind what is happening right now, and in fact the threat goes into all the three countries, is the economic difficulties which are being faced, and political leadership coming into criticism as a result of that, and the economic chaos and job loss coming from there. Now we see that as far as Iran is concerned, what triggered this particular demonstration was the fact that the government raised the price of petroleum to roughly $49 cents per gallon. If you compare this with the United States, it's only 2.5 or 2.50 cents per gallon, so increase. But you know, Iran has the fourth largest oil reserves in the world, and the Iranians take it as a birthright to have access to cheap petrol. This is something that they have been. Now, by what has happened was that because of the fact of the crippling war that they had with Iraq, following what happened with in Iraq later, with the Middle East wars and so on, then the nuclear sanctions coming from there, and accelerated further by the unilateral withdrawal of America from the nuclear deal. The result is that at the time of the withdrawal, $1 was 32,000 riyals in 2015. Today, it is $1 is equal to 123,000 riyals. So there has been a huge amount of depreciation of the value and the purchasing power of the people of Iran, and they are now therefore obliged to find alternate means. And the country and the people, they are protesting because although the government has justified the rise for of about 2.6 billion is what they expect, but to raise it in order to support the low-income families, almost about 20 million low-income families to support them. But the fact is that there is a lot of corruption there, and also the fact that by subsidizing the oil, it is only the rich which and
lastly, what you're saying, what I've gathered is like things will get worse for them.
Yes.
So, as the time is passing, yes, and plus the threat of the Americans, they are present in the region with all their assets. Primarily, sir, is it just because if you look at the history, sir, whether you talk about Afghanistan, you talk about Iraq, or any other country which was invaded by the Americans in the name of democracy, or the war on terror, or weapons of mass destruction, whatever means or reasons they had, sir. But those countries have become absolutely, they can't be governed. Look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq for that matter, sir. Iraq, according to most of the analysts, was one of the best countries in the Middle East with best infrastructure, and even the social responsibility of the regime then, of Saddam Hussein, was pretty good actually. But though they had issues with the Kurds, and that was a separate chapter altogether. But Ibn Saab, let's throw light. I mean, do you think, or do you see some sort of a war between these two countries, or maybe a strike on their nuclear sites, or something of that sort? Because it seems that the Americans are just waiting. Maybe they're trying the other means, but at the end of the day, there is a possibility. Maybe not before the elections, but maybe after the elections of the United States of America, sir?
I think it's, what surprises me is the synchronized eruption of riots, street protests in Iraq, Lebanon, and Iran. In Iraq, they started on 1st of October, in Lebanon, 15th of October, and in Iran on 15th of November. So it's within 45 days, you have 3 countries that have crises for almost similar reasons. And USA has openly supported the crisis.
Can you relate it to the Arab Spring, sir? Is it a part of the similar deal or something?
I'll come to it. Now, USA has openly supported the people's peaceful protests in Lebanon. They've supported the peaceful protests by the people in Iran, and they were also very close to the previous prime minister in Iraq, who was forced to resign. So there is definite an element of behind the scene forces that you can see working in all these 3 countries. Who's going to benefit? Are the same people, the same states, same countries that were a month back or 2 months back were threatening Iran with dire consequences through military action. Now that military action probably subsided after attacks on Saudi oil refineries, and after the obvious threat that probably the conflagration will not only harm the Iranians, but it will probably take the entire world down by stopping the supply of oil through Persian Gulf. That would have been a catastrophe for the entire world.
That would be the worst case scenario.
Worst case scenario. So there were simultaneous plans, what you see in action. That once they were threatening those people, but behind the scenes there were massive movements going on amongst the people. And when you look at the Iraqi protests, they have been against the political elite in that country.
Correct.
And the blame has been, or the allegations have been largely of corruption and inefficiency and lack of services to the people, and also foreign interference in their affairs. And probably a part of that crowd was maneuvered to attack the Iranian consulate twice in Najaf.
Yes.
So that probably you may
Flags
see
were
as
burnt, the portraits and the
so
posters were burnt. Yeah.
You may look at those attacks on Iranian consulates as giving a direction to the protests in Iraq, but primarily those protests broke out because of the corruption and lack of services to the people. Look at Lebanon. In Lebanon,
Saad Hariri had to resign.
In Iraq, Adil Abdul Mahdi had to resign. In Lebanon, Saad Hariri had to resign. Now, there again, the crisis was managed through the banks. When In Lebanon, you have Lebanese pound and the American dollar both being used as currency in Lebanon. Suddenly, a time comes when the Lebanese banks, they stop giving dollars to the people, to people. So people, they rush to the banks, they attacked banks, they attacked the ATMs, and from there people came on the street because they wanted their dollars. They always thought probably, and it has been a saga of corruption for the last many years. But they have the problem similar to us, what we had. Lebanon had and still has a very large budget deficit and a huge public debt. So and these two things are a result of
primarily the economic crisis.
Economic crisis is a result of very long mismanagement, economic mismanagement by the government for many years. Something similar to that probably we were facing, and maybe we have come out of it, or maybe we're about to come out of it. So what you see over there is a very calculated support to the people through the social media to bring them on roads, on the streets against the government. Now here it has both in Iraq, Iran and Lebanon, it has a similarity to the Arab Spring. In Iran, Mr. Pompeo just probably a couple of days back, maybe a week back, he admitted that we have been supporting the Iranian people in continue to communicate on the internet. So they probably provided technologies to the people that they could circumvent the restrictions by the Iranian government to stop communications on the
internet.
Shut
down the internet in Iran also.
So, but they could not. So the Iranian people continued to encrypt and continue to use internet because of the American help, and that is what has probably generated such a synchronized protest in all the cities in Iran. Now, when you look at Iraq, Lebanon and Iran in 45 days, then you're reminded of Tunisia in 2010, and then
years.
Libya and Yemen and other countries that all went
The
through
whole
the same thing.
of Northern Africa,
So
primarily.
who benefits?
The Americans did.
No, the Israelis benefits.
Because the weaker the governments are, the stronger the Israel is.
No, what you see is the Israeli political crisis at the moment that's going on, and their lack of having a government, and at the same time their attempts to recognize the 1973 borders with Jordan as now their borders, so that
is going to be the official border now.
Yeah, so that attempt probably would die down under the noise of the bigger crisis
so basically, sir,
Middle
all
East.
these crises are created also.
They're all created.
So primarily to divert the attention from the main issues towards some non-issues, I
And
would
what
say.
it comes out of is it comes out of the joint action plan, the planned action plan, JCPOA, that America signed with Iran, and America plus 5 countries that signed with Iran. Now, having signed that, if you go back at that time when this JCPOA was signed, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, when it was signed, Iran experienced a resurgence. Iran, because he thought now that they have their ties amended with the Americans, they suddenly opened their markets to Europe and even to Boeing and Airbus. And there are huge contracts given to Boeing and Airbus. Now, and they will also had a rush of European companies coming into Iran.
I still remember, sir, when Mr. Rouhani was visiting Italy, and then he went to France, if you remember.
So that resurgence,
500 planes, can you imagine?
So that resurgence in Iran actually gave Iran a breather to continue to exercise its influence in the region.
I understand. So, there was a time when Iran had direct flights to the United States of America. I mean, very influential country.
When Iran had the economic breather to continue to exercise influence in Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and also probably in Yemen, so that is what frightened the Israelis, the Saudis, and the Americans.
All right.
So they had to curb that, and that is where, when Mr. Trump came in, he rescinded that particular agreement, +5 agreement with the JCPOA with the Iran, so that and all the companies that had rushed to Europe, they went back.
It went back, and even the
And
European companies, those companies which were very powerful, they were not very happy because there was a lot of business coming in.
so suddenly, Iran lost that economic space to be effective in Middle East. So that is where the entire
That was
crisis.
all done
that
by,
is-
by,
that
by
is where-
design,
yeah,
sir.
by
Sir,
design.
because I've got a couple of very interesting questions for you also. But sir, let me go to Mr. Imran Jan. Imran sir, looking at the statement coming from Mr. Pompeo, where he says that this Irani government is primarily that is the villain in the region and is behind all the protests that are taking place in Iran, in Iraq, or in Lebanon, for that matter, sir. How do you see this? Is that some kind of a threat?
Well, Iran has always, can you hear me? Iran has always been a punching bag for every American administration, every American president, especially the regime that came after the 1979 revolution. Um, when we mention the people protesting in Lebanon, Iraq, and primarily in Iran,
Imran sir, we
we
can't hear
keep
you, sir.
referring to them as protesters.
I'll just
I'm
request
not sure
Mr.
if I can
reconnect Mr. Imran because we can't hear him. But anyway, coming back to you, Ambassador Sir, very interesting statement given by Mr. Imran says, Iran has always been the punching bag, despite the fact that no matter what happens, where it happens, Iranians are blamed for that. Maybe as far as the failure in Afghanistan is concerned, the American regime always blames Pakistan for it. In this particular case, sir, if you have created a mess in the region, sir, let's not blame Iran. I think they have fought very hard, and eventually they've been able to come to this level. I would say P5+1 formula, or JCPOA, as earlier mentioned by Ibn Saab. I mean, everybody was there, everybody supported it. The American president, Mr. Barack Obama, was on board, and everybody said this is the deal of the century, I remember. Not from Mr. Jawad Zarif, who was, I think, one of the best negotiators in that whole group. But at the end of the day, sir, back to square one. Rather, further back.
Well, you know, it's not that the Americans are now and the Israelis now are thinking that because of the recent resurgence of the economic power of, especially after the nuclear deal, that they are wanting to look down upon Iran to try and bring it down. You know, all the three countries before the nuclear deal, of course, in Lebanon, from 1975 to 1990, the civil war that was there, who was behind that? You know, it was going at that time. Who was supporting it? In Iraq, the Gulf War was well before any nuclear deal. And as far as Iran is concerned, they've been trying to put it, you know, under its thumb ever since 1979. So it's not a recent thing about Iran. Historically, as pointed out, Iran has been on the radar of America after the fall of Shah, who was the kingpin in the region with Iran and Israel on the other side. So it is to the credit
Sir,
of
would you consider that a miscalculation of the Americans when they changed the regime? Because we all know who was behind the regime. Shah was so close to the Americans. I mean, I still remember those F-14s and everything. I mean, Iran was one of the most powerful players in the region, sir. Post 1979, almost 40 years have passed, so things have totally changed in the Middle East. Do you think the dirty role of the Americans, it's very obvious now?
Yes, I mean, they were caught, you know, with the pants down, so to speak, because they were totally surprised to see this man, Khomeini, coming in and to America. And look what happened to this man. He didn't even have a place to be buried. He was going from country to country.
Later on
and
was
so
buried
on.
in Egypt, yeah.
So this is a typical thing of America. They prop up dictators, and you know, when they don't need their services anymore, you know, they don't even, you know, they literally throw them to the dungeons. We've seen this happening in the, you know, and all over the Philippines. You can see it also happening in Americas. This is their pattern in the past. Now, the important thing is that it is to the credit of Iran that despite all the pressures on it, it has been through its resilience, through its diplomacy, it has been able to maintain itself. It's been considered as an axis of evil at one time, if you remember, with
Yes.
Korea as well, North Korea. So it has been able to overcome this, and it was, as you earlier pointed out, was on the path to stability, economic well-being, and so on, and they were able to make their place and their rightful place in the Middle East. But then again, this got worried, we got the people worried, having eliminated one country after the other for the Israelis, starting from Egypt and deal with Jordan, and then going on to doing away with Gaddafi and doing away with Tunisia and so on. So the only people remaining, of course, in
These were
Iraq.
the old regimes, were there for
Yes.
like 4 decades, maybe more in certain cases.
Iraq, and then of course they were wanting to go after Syria and Iran. So these are indirectly benefiting, or this is at the behest of the Israelis. So the whole Middle East policy is, as we can see, especially under Trump, is trying to consolidate the Israeli hold in the region. And these steps that have been taken, moving the Jerusalem as the capital, the Golan Heights, and dwelling being
Absolutely.
established
West
and
Bank.
so on, and
Yeah.
now the border and so forth. These are all designs from the Americans, and they are hoping that with these moves, Trump is thinking that both in America itself, he'll be able to come back with the Jewish support for another term in the office, and as much as right now, with the trouble being faced by other hardliner Netanyahu, who's having difficulties, not only politically
the
but
government, yes.
also corruption charges, etc., on him. So it's the whole thing behind is, like I said, to start with, introspection needs to be done for the chaos being done by the Americans themselves. They are responsible for all the 3 countries where we are today. They have been the one who is creating the troubles and so forth. If these countries were left on their own, they were peaceful countries way back in the past. You pointed
Most
out,
of these countries, look at Turkey, look at Iran, look at Pakistan, they were all allies of the sent to see to. I mean, you talk about it, they were part of. Sir, if you allow me, sir, we join in again by Mr. Imran. Imran, sir, I hope you can hear me this time, sir.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Perfect, sir. Perfect. Thank you so much. Now, Imran sir, my earlier question to you was regarding the statement issued by Mr. Pompeo. Do you think that there is a very high probability of some sort of an airstrike or some sort of a misadventure, may I call that, in the Middle East by the Americans?
I do not believe that that is going to happen, and the reason for that is Washington's playbook in order to deal with regimes they don't like is either to invade the country if it's a completely defenseless state, which Iran is not, because they hold the cards in the Strait of Hormuz, where I believe 40% of the global oil supply happens, and they have these strong moving boats that they use to deal with any sort of misadventure. Secondly, if invasion is not the option, then they assassinate leaders, which they also probably cannot do, although the Israelis are they have been assassinating some of their nuclear scientists to slow down the Iranian nuclear activity. So if assassination is not going to happen and invasion is not going to happen, then the playbook comes down to exactly what is happening. And I was mentioning earlier, I'm not sure if I should be calling these people protesting in the streets of Iran as protesters, because their behavior is more in line with what are called shock troops, Washington's shock troops. Remember, Mujahideen Khalq, MEK, is an organization that was declared as a terrorist group by the United States, by the State Department. That had been active in Iran. They have killed so many Americans in Iran and in other countries. Since 2012, they have been strong allies of the United States. And I strongly believe that's those people who are active right now in Iran, protesting against oil price hike, which also brings me to the other argument. If you put crippling sanctions on a country, which they call maximum pressure on a country, what are they going to do? They cannot sell their oil. No country is going to invest in that country. They have to do something in order to keep paying their bills, keep the country going. And so the playbook is you put sanctions, you put maximum pressure, and whatever they do as a result are going to make the people angry. So Pompeo even advocated that we should be supplying
possible avenues of the use of internet to people in Iran. All of a sudden, they're so concerned about people's rights to protest. Do you want to fight against corruption in a country? Go to Israel. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu right now is facing corruption charges. You want to help them too? Do you want to invade that country, or do you want to go support
Americans
people,
have very different
especially
standards for
30% of the Arab population, to rise against Benjamin Netanyahu? That's never the question. That's never the argument. So it's all about, when it comes to U.S. and Iran, it is all about, basically it boils down to two things: imperialism and oil. That's what it has been from day one. And we have to go back to understand the whole thing. We have to go back to the history a little bit. Operation Ajax, which the CIA now, by the way, officially acknowledged that they did, was about removing the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, because he had nationalized Iranian's oil to give it to its own people. So they removed him, they installed the Shah, whose regime, 17 years of, or I don't know how many years of his regime, are marked by the worst human rights abuses in the history of Iran. And then as soon as he was removed in 1979 revolution in Iran, all of a sudden the United States started hating that country, because it is the only country in that region that is standing up to the United States, that is saying no to the bully behavior that the United States is showing. That's why they don't like it. And the other, of course, story is all about oil. Now they cannot get access to that oil so much, so they're going to stop other countries from buying it too.
Now, there was another story, Imran Sahib, in which around 6 European Union countries, they want to do barter trade with Iran.
Yes, but that deal that one of the panelists mentioned, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is the nickname of which is the Iran nuclear deal that Obama signed with Iran, President Trump, one of the first things he did when he came in the office was to literally rip apart that whole agreement.
Yes.
And so he threatened countries. The United States threatened European and any country in the world that they should not do business with Iran, that they should not buy Iranian oil. And the Iranians and even the Russians and the Europeans are sticking to that agreement. French President Macron even tried to come up with an alternative solution so the deal could work, but President Trump doesn't want to do that. He's more openly pro-Israel than any other president we have seen, recognizing Jerusalem.
Primarily, I think, Imran Sahib, if you allow me, let me put this question to AVM Sahib. Sir, if you remember, sir, when Trump took charge as the president of the United States of America, his first visit was in Saudi Arabia, and it seemed very funny the way he was doing hundreds of billions of dollars of deals. Like, for example, I remember the Crown Prince was sitting next to him and he said, well, I think 4.6 billion, yeah, that's great. And that's peanuts for you. And he was laughing, So practically right after that, he was in Israel. Jared Kushner, who is the senior advisor and was also the son-in-law of the president, he has played a very important role in bringing Israel further close to the Americans, because there were a lot of issues. There were so many problems emerging as well, because a lot of people within the corridors of power in the United States of America believe that too much support for the Israelis is actually creating a lot of problems for the Americans all over the world. Sir.
If you look at the American objectives or the American-Israeli objectives in Iran, they were primarily to renegotiate the nuclear deal, and the second objective was to curtail the Iranian influence in the Middle East, those countries. Now what you see is that very clearly those two objectives have merged into a regime change objective in Iran. So what you're saying is probably now what you're saying is that both, and that also suits the Arabs as well, because what you see as a regime change is the same process that you saw in Iraq. A regime change followed by a big chaos in that particular country, and people having no representation in the government over there. And what you see in Libya, two governments being run over there. So that's what the plan is. That while you you bring that chaos and that anarchy in Iran, you also have time to move into Lebanon and Iraq and Syria to get your own influence there and install your own people. So it's a huge plan that is being implemented at this particular time to curtail not only Iran, but also to have a very comprehensive kind of a hold on the political system in these four countries. So what you're seeing is not only containing Iranian influence in the world or containing Iranian influence in the region, but you're also seeing a complete change of political complexion in this particular region, and that obviously is being engineered to finally give Israel a legitimate status in that particular area. And that probably what Mr. Obama had seen as a main problem, and he had been resisting the Israeli overtures in those in his time frame, in his 8 years. And that is what probably prompted the Israelis to influence American election in 2016 to support Trump so openly. And the epic,
and honestly speaking, Evim Saab, we were all surprised.
Yeah.
Nobody actually, except for a very few people, everybody thought that Hillary Clinton is going to be the first female president of Justice of America.
If you look at the single country that benefits the most out of the entire crisis, you find Israel.
And it's $3 billion a year aid from USA, other than whatever they're getting.
And what you
Just
see
imagine.
is what you see is the greater Israeli context or the dream of the Jews or the Zionists that is coming true, and that is unless these 4 or 5 countries surrounding that area, unless they are in chaos, unless they are in turmoil, Israeli probably those Israeli actions of annexation of the Western Bank and the other
So today there was this story. It says very interesting one. It says US to recognize Jordan Valley as Israel's eastern border.
If you look at history, whenever Israel took such steps, prior to those steps of Israel or the American recognition of Israeli Jerusalem as the capital, there has been a turmoil created in the neighboring countries. That has been a set pattern for the last 20 years. Anything that Israel does since 2001, 9/11, that has been a pattern, that a turmoil is created, and then Israel moves in and captures certain more territories or makes some more settlements or makes some more gains. So that is the pattern that you see in the last 20 years.
Israel is expanding, sir, slowly but surely, sir.
So that's the only country.
Left, right and center, the only country which doesn't have any borders as such, sir, because they're just moving.
That's the only country that benefits.
Maybe at some stage they'll be looking for a chunk of land from Iraq and from Saudi Arabia and from Syria maybe.
So
you never know.
territorially, Israel benefits, and the peripheral, the spin-off comes to the Arab countries, UAE and Saudi Arabia.
Primarily they are supporting
Yeah.
the other parties, sir. You want like to add something?
Well, let me just say that, yes, the trouble is taking place in these countries, but it is basically political and economic, underground and lack of jobs, etc. In all the three, this is the underlying factor in all the 3 countries. Iran, as I mentioned earlier, has had lots of experience in handling protesters and so on, mentioned the number of years. It has developed tools how to handle, such demonstrations and so on, and has a complete media control capacity now that they are able to project. Look at the difference. They are talking about 200 or so people killed and so on. Iranians are talking about a couple of, a handful of people. Nobody knows the real situation. So I have
The Americans or the amnesties, they say that 208 people got killed.
Well, I mean,
That's the figure there.
But the point is that nobody really knows. Now, the other thing is that there is no doubt that they will be able to quell this uprising or whatever it is. And I think, on the contrary, this will probably have a backlash for the Americans, because the chances are in the February elections, the same people will come back with greater majority and with more power to them. Now, the same applies with Iraq. Iraq also, reading the reports and so forth, the closing these 3 bridges and so on has caused a lot of hardship for the people.
Oh, sir, I mean,
frustration.
half of Iraq is almost shut.
And that appears it's also fizzling out. It's a matter of time and so on. And Lebanon, yes, Hezbollah is very much there. They have not come out against the protesters. They have been supported them. They have not directly gone against them and so on. But they're also, their demand is President Awani to retire, because they feel that the political setup that has been there ever since the end of the civil war will perpetuate again. So they want a major breakthrough. So there's slightly different
But they've
scenario.
been in power, Ayatollah Khamenei's mindset has been in power, I would say, for the last 4 decades. It is not that easy to change it overnight.
Yes.
So let
But
me put
just,
this...
just
go
quickly,
ahead, sir.
just finish this, that although these things are has been orchestrated here in 3 countries, but chances are that all these 3 countries will be able to ride it over. But at the same time, they will have to devote their attention to the genuine demands of the people, political changes, economic, greater access to them and so on. For example, just for quickly on Iran, subsidizing the petrol and so on helps the wealthy, and the smuggling which goes across the borders. So it's eating away resources and so forth. So they have to check all this.
Yeah, definitely, sir. I was reading a story in which they said that the Iranians have found another huge reserve of oil and gas in the southwestern region. So you can well imagine, obviously, when Imran Sahib says that oil is the deal, actually.
Imperialism and oil.
That is he's very rightly pointed out. Imran Sahib, over to you, sir, for the closing remarks. Let me put this question also, sir. That let's suppose Donald Trump wins the next election, and he's elected as the next president for 4 years. Do you see further hostile actions against Iran, sir? And if so, till what level?
Absolutely. Regardless of who wins the election, either Donald Trump or some Democratic representative, the relationship with Iran is going to remain the same. I do not see any warlike situation developing between these 2 countries, because the United States is wary, it is tired of war at the moment. It also is a declining power. If you look at the grand scheme of things, it's not as strong as it used to be. At the same time, Donald Trump, however, for lack of a better way of saying it, however bad he talks, however bad mouthing he does, he doesn't really invade countries. We have seen he has not invaded countries after countries as previous presidents have done. So under his regime, I do not see a warlike situation between Iran and the United States, but at the same time, the relationship will not improve because the Ayatollahs control Iran, and they're not going to surrender 1 iota of power over that country, regardless of Rouhani's in power or some other guy is in power. There's a system in place which would be called an establishment. They control everything, especially the foreign policy. So no, war is not going to happen between the 2 countries, and at the same time, relationship is going to continue like that because, again, they are the only ones in that region standing up to the United States, to the Israelis, and at the same time, they're supporting the groups that are against Israel, for example, Hezbollah, which again, the U.S. media keeps referring to Hezbollah as a militant, violent group. It's a political party also. It is an elected party in that country.
It is actually a political party, yeah.
Yes.
But anyway, thank you very much. So over to you for the last
I
question.
think I would like to say that fire is closer home. We need to learn from the uprisings or the way the situations have been manipulated in Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran. I think we were almost at the economic precipice a couple of months back, and the same thing could be generated, same unrest. There's a possibility that if the rising situations are not handled properly, probably we could be the 4th country, just in line with Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, and then Pakistan.
What do you think, Maulana Fazl Rehman, when he was all over the road, sir? What sort of an impression was given? The Americans are supporting all these protests, sir. Yeah. Look at the way the media is giving them coverage. Hong Kong protest has become a story and a half everywhere, sir.
So what you see as peaceful protests, and everywhere the peaceful protests today are being supported by the American government. They have
their own objectives.
So I think we need to be careful.
We need to be careful, sir, because we are also in the line of duty at the moment. Anyway, sir, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you very much, Imran Saab. And that's all we have for this hour. I'll see you inshallah tomorrow. Till then, you take good care. Khuda Hafiz.